Hello everyone, my name is Austin, this is Veloce Midwest, and it is now 2024, and if you're a car person, you know that means we can now import more cars into the US, this time up to the model year of 1999. And when I say we can import more cars from, what I mean is we can watch like the Car Guru's website and look at dealerships as they import cars, and we can just dream about having them ourselves, because you know how it goes. And so what this means is there's a lot of new Japanese and Euro cars that are now eligible to come into the United States because they meet the 25-year-old import rule. Which is to say a car has to be 25 years or older before it can be imported into the US, which basically means it's obsolete in the eyes of the NHTSA. Good for any enthusiast who wanted something they really wanted, or they saw something that they really wanted that was never sold here and they couldn't get it. Well, praise be, we can get them. So here's the thing, there are a lot of cars that can be imported for the 1999 model year. A lot of Euro cars, a lot of Japanese cars, and I don't want this video to drag on forever, so I'm going to split it into two parts. One for Japanese imports, which is going to be this video, and then two for Euro imports, which will be the next video. And hopefully I found some really interesting cars on this list here. I don't want to look like every other list basically, so I've tried to go out and find some more obscure, interesting little things that maybe most people would gloss over. Although that said, we're definitely going to start with the usual suspects here. So starting off for 1999, we of course have the Skyline R34 GT-R. Now technically the R34 generation of Skylines was already available to be imported since March, but the GT-R spec was not produced until January of 1999, and that's important, the month, because the way the rule works, it's not just the year or the model year, it is the month and the per year for production, so the month and production year. So in other words, if a car wasn't produced until, say, July of 1999, you cannot import that car. Of course, the earliest you can import that car is July. You can't import it in January just because it's a 1999 production year or model year. Now, the GT-R name is, of course, probably the biggest name on this list. It's the one that, a lot of people have been waiting to see stateside legally. Technically, a lot of these have made their way over here illegally, and some of them were destroyed. This is, of course, largely due in part to the car's major role and appearance in the Fast and Furious 2. I'm sorry, Too Fast, Too Furious. How silly of me to forget the incredible naming convention of the second Fast and Furious movie. And to some extent, this is probably one of the cooler GT-Rs, and I think it was probably one of the last GT-Rs before the specific GT-R car came out, which, basically was no longer part of the Skyline range after this. So it's probably the biggest, baddest Skyline you can get. That is up until you get to like special editions like the V-Spec. Now prices for these cars at the time of making this video are already going to be pretty much through the roof, so for most of us it's just more of a dream than anything. About 150 grand is where I'm starting to see some prices start. So yeah, and if you want something more rare like a V-Spec or V-Spec N, of which only about 38 units were ever made, then you better be ready to fork out just a little bit more. Or if you want to save up more money, which is probably what you'll need, you can wait till next year for 2000 for the V-Spec 2, which is basically an even bigger, meaner, and also very limited version of the R34 GT-R. But I get it, we probably don't all have $150,000 for a GT-R. So maybe you want to go a little bit cheaper, and maybe a little more practical, a 2-door, 4-door. The other big fish on this list, which is kind of an interesting one, the Mitsubishi Lancer Evo VI. Now the Evo VI actually really isn't all that different from the Evo V. Basically it's new bodywork, there's improved cooling for the engine and some of the braking components. But aside from that, it's really similar, not that much different. But for anyone who wanted maybe a slightly more tailored version of the 5, the 6 is probably the way to go, and now you can import one. However, may I actually suggest that if you want more of a, slightly more cars and coffee-ish type model, something you can talk about with other people and, you just want to feel a little more special, there is, of course, the Tommy Mäkinen edition. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, it's a Finnish name, and I'll explain. In other words, this car is named after the Finnish World Rally champion Tommy Makinen. How do you pronounce the little A's with the dots over them? It's also just called the TME, and this actually is a somewhat more special, more souped up version of a Lancer 6, and had a host of new equipment attached to it, including a titanium turbine in the turbo, which apparently spools a lot faster than the base unit. So a little extra performance there. There was only 4,062 of these made, so it's not super rare, but it's a little less common than the regular Evo, and that might make it worth tracking down. However, there's also the RS Sprint. The RS Sprint is basically an even more souped up version, because you didn't think any of the previous versions of the Evo 6 were souped up enough, because this car is now not only lighter, but the engine's been tuned to make more power, about 330 horsepower, over the regular standing about 270 horsepower or so. So it's lighter and more power, so yeah, it's probably a lot faster, a lot quicker. And if you're looking for more of a performance-oriented Lancer Evo 6, then the RS Sprint is definitely the way to go. And then there's the Nissan 300ZX. Alright, so we got this car, of course, and over in Japan it's actually called the Fairlady Z. The thing is, we stopped getting it after '96. So, in other words, we basically started missing out on some of the model year changes, including the 1999 Facelift model. Basically, the car was changed up a little bit, interior was revised, exterior body panels were changed, certain trims got new equipment on the outside and the inside. The convertible was completely dropped for this year, so don't go looking for a 99 Fairlady Cabrio. And it's just basically a version of the car that we didn't get. And that might make it worth something for some people, especially those who really like the Nissan Z series of cars, and the old ZXs and the 300s and all that, especially if you want like a right-hand drive version of that car. There are also some performance upgrades to the car too, if you prefer stock performance stuff. In other words, they basically completely redid the shifting mechanisms for the car, so it just shifts different. The transmission's gone through some changes as well, and the linkages, and they also basically kind of restructure the chassis just a little bit to make it a little more rigid, so it's probably a better track car, is how I would take that. And the same can be said for the Honda S2000, another sports car we actually got in the US, but with 99, its debut year, you can now get the earliest of the Japanese spec versions if that's something you want. Not probably too terribly different than what we got here, but if you really prefer a right-hand drive version to get into that, JDM mindset or whatever, then now you can do that. You can get Japanese spec S2000s. And that could be really cool just by itself instead of, and it just kind of opens up, S2000s are becoming more valuable, they're becoming maybe a little harder to come by in some ways, and now you can finally look overseas and your, pool of S2000 resources is now expanded. You can get more now. You don't have to just confine your searching to, the United States if that's where you are, because that's what this is mostly about, United States imports. I think I already made that clear. Although, with that said, maybe you're also the type of person who maybe wants sportiness and practicality mixed into one. Well, I do have an option for you. Now, first off, this first car might not sound super sporty. That would be the Honda Avancier, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is basically based on the Honda Accord 6th Gen. It is a Honda Accord wagon, essentially, that we didn't get in the United States. It's an okay, interesting car. It looks kind of interesting. But now, if you want a performance wagon, and that's kind of where I was leading into, well, guess what? You're in luck. There was also an Accord wagon, a performance version that we also didn't get, called the SiR. And there's also the regular Honda Accord SiR 2, I think, is also now available to import. But this is the wagon version. And they were all automatics, but you did get a VTEC making about 206 horsepower. It's an inline 4. And, all your sportier suspension that the SiR trims of Honda cars generally came with. Now, with that said, there was actually also a 3-liter V6 version of both of these wagons, although I do not believe that engine was ever paired with the SiR trim. So the SiR trim is just the 200 horsepower, 2.3-liter inline 4. The V6 is just kind of its own thing. All right, so I know not everyone wants just sports cars. I mean, most people. Okay, so sports cars are cool. Most people are probably more interested in the sports cars you can import, but what about the more daily cars, the luxury cars? Especially from Japan, because Japan's always had some really interesting approaches to luxury cars. Stuff like the Nissan President Sima, the Toyota Celsior, Century, Crown, Well, don't worry, I got some luxury cars for you. First off, let's talk about one of the biggest luxury cars that Japan's had that we've never had, until more recently, of course, and that is the Toyota Crown. Now, we only just recently got the 16th generation Toyota Crown, but this car, of course, is being sold in Japan for much longer. And that includes, in 1999, the beginning of the 11th generation of Crown. Now, these actually won't be available until September, so there's that little caveat again there. If you actually want one of these, sure, it's $99, but you gotta wait until September to actually get it, or at least to start getting it. Basically, this is when the Crown adopted a little bit more of a Lexus style. And if you look at it, it looks a little bit like an LS Lexus. Of course, it's Toyota badged, or technically more so, it's more Crown badged. It's more Crown badges than Toyota badges on it. And this was basically like a smaller, still luxurious, but smaller version of what the Toyota Century was. You know, not quite as prestigious as the Century, but still relatively nice. Instead of V8 engines, you had a whole series of inline sixes, the 1JZs, 2JZ variations. Not quite as smooth maybe, but you know, it kind of makes sense the way they structure their luxury cars and the way who they expect to buy. You know, like your top end CEOs obviously are kind of meant to buy the Century. The guys underneath them are meant to buy like the Crown, is the way I think that's kind of the way it goes, so the way they see it anyways. You can get this in the Royal or the Athlete trim. The Athlete comes with a 2.5 liter turbocharged 1JZ. And there's also a wagon version, because I know a lot of enthusiasts like wagons, so I've got to bring up the wagons when the wagons are available. And, you know, that's pretty cool. There's kind of a luxury wagon with the Crown name on it. Now, that's actually not until December, though. That's when they start producing them. But that is this year, technically speaking. So, yeah, it sounds a little bit more like next year, I guess. But technically, that's this year. Okay, but inline six isn't going to cut it for your Japanese luxury car. Okay, you want something you can just get this year, because, you know, Centuries have already kind of been a thing, and some of those come with V12s too if you prefer V12, but you want a V8. Let's say you want a V8. Mitsubishi Dignity. So the Dignity is actually based on the Hyundai Ecus, which is basically the same car, more or less. It was actually a co-development between Mitsubishi and Hyundai. And the Ecus is actually also available to import for $99, just in case you're interested. And this was basically one of those V8 Japanese super luxury car type things that was meant to compete with the other V8 ones, like the Nissan Presidents and the Crowns I'm sorry, not the Crowns, but the Centuries and the Celsiors, which have the V8s. The only difference between this one and those, though, most of those are rear-wheel drive with a V8. The Mitsubishi was a bit different. It was front-wheel drive, and I think it may have been one of the only cars in its class there that was a front-wheel drive V8 luxury saloon, and it even had the transversely mounted engine, a 4.5 liter V8 that was again co-developed with Hyundai. And this actually was a pretty cool car in some ways, though they didn't make it for very long. It actually only made it from 99 to 2001. It was not a long-lived car, though they would bring the Dignity name back a number of years later for a different car, which is kind of meant to be like a successor. But for the time, this was actually kind of a cool car. It had a lot of tech that makes me think of like vehicles from only maybe like the past 10, 15 years. But this is 1999 with, you know, lane departure warnings, had LiDAR with adaptive cruise control, or had LiDAR for adaptive cruise control on a 99 car. I feel like that's kind of cool. There were maybe some others, but I haven't heard of them. So that's kind of cool, I think, just by itself. Self-leveling air suspension with dampening control. I had a blind spot monitor. Again, I think some of this stuff may have been a little more common in other cars, maybe in its segment from that time, but I don't really think of it too often. I definitely think of it as being something you've seen on more cars recently, I guess. And even some luxury cars and even some non-luxury cars. But I guess that's kind of how that technology works. It shows up on the really high-end cars really early on and then kind of trickles its way down into the more lower-end cars as time goes on. I don't think Mitsubishi really makes anything else kind of like this anymore. They've gotten a little bit more... They've kind of left that market, I think, but there's probably not a lot of money to be made there, especially when your competitors are like Toyota and Lexus, and it kind of makes sense. K-cars. We all like K-cars. They're small, they're fun, they're light, they're tiny, they're fuel efficient, they're very, very goofy on American roads, and they don't make any sense on American roads, and you'll probably die if you try to use one regularly on a highway. But, you know, that's probably all part of the appeal. So first off, let's talk about the Daihatsu Mira Gino. Now, Daihatsu did not ever really have a big presence in the US. We didn't really get a lot of Daihatsu branded cars. Obviously, Japan did. And they made K cars, little off-road trucks sometimes. And they made some of the utility commercial vehicles. I think what we mostly saw in the US were Daihatsu commercial vehicles. Now this, of course, is not that at all. In fact, this is one of those really specific K cars that came in a period where Japanese automakers were trying to make these more like retro styled things. Think like the Toyota Classic or the Nissan Figaro and the POW. And this car fits right in with those. The Mira Gino is very clearly and obviously based off of a Mini Cooper in the styling department. Although it's also supposedly technically kind of based on the old Daihatsu Compagno sports car. Though obviously the Austin Mini design is the most obvious, probably because it's a hatchback. But the front end does kind of resemble that old Daihatsu sports car too. Of course, as a K car, it has a tiny little engine. It's a little inline 3. I have your 658cc, nice. 58 horsepower, nice. Hopefully it is as fun to drive as it looks. If you like this styling of car though and you must have more power, well don't worry, in 2002 you can import the Mira Gino 1000. That has a 1 liter inline 4 that's good for 63 horsepower. Oh, I'm sorry, it's still an inline 3. I guess I was getting my hopes up a little bit there, I guess. And how about a second one from Daihatsu, the risque sounding Daihatsu Naked? It's Japan. They gotta have, we all know the memes, and they gotta be a little risque sometimes, and I guess that's what this car is. But the Naked is also a completely different kind of risqueness in some aspect, an automotive risqueness. That is to say, it's one of those vehicles where they decided to style it like an off-road vehicle, though it's not built for off-road in the slightest. It uses the same powertrain as the Mira Gino, actually, the same engine, same power, same output. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It kind of has some off-road styling to it. The boxing has the exposed door hinges, stuff like that. But obviously, of course, I mean, you can maybe modify it to go off-road, you know, put some bigger wheels on it. But yeah, it's an interesting car. It's definitely more of a conversation starter type car than anything you'll really use for anything more than commuting probably. But that's actually what probably makes these cars nice. And I know for some people, these kind of K cars, especially these more hatchback ones, are really useful for kind of like those mercenary postal workers type of thing, you know, where they need their own little vehicle and they probably need something kind of fuel efficient to, you know, do their postal routes. And usually a right-hand drive car makes that a little easier too, you know, get up to mailboxes. I'd say this is probably a good car for that. Daihatsu, not a well-known brand in the US. Okay, got a couple left. All right, now how about a more familiar brand, the Nissan Hypermini.
Would you want to drive this car?
Well, I think they're adorable, and I would drive one in a second.
I wouldn't drive one of these cars because I think they look ugly.
What is this? Well, it's a cute little K car. Look at it. It's got little curves, a little roundness to it. It's also the only EV on this list.
I think they look ugly.
Okay, I know, and some people are like, oh, EVs, I don't want an EV. Well, okay, think of it this way, it's a cute little EV. It's also really rare, because I couldn't even find one for sale, and it's got kind of an interesting story, and if you look at it, it's obviously kind of like a precursor to the Nissan Leaf. Basically, these were more experimental cars from Nissan. They only made 32 horsepower, had a full range of like 71 miles on a full charge. And the thing is, and I've seen differing numbers, they seem to either made 219 or they made 300 of these. One of the two. Only between 99 and 2001. And a handful actually did make their way to California for testing purposes, but then they were recalled by Nissan when their leases ended because Nissan didn't have any plans to continue support for this vehicle. So did they recall all of them everywhere? I don't know. Maybe, but that makes it an interesting car to at least find. And you know, maybe that's part of finding some of these cars. It's like the thrill of the hunt kind of thing. Obviously things like battery degradation don't exactly, you know, that kind of factors in. So how well would they even last today? Which means you just gotta get creative and drop an LS in it. And that brings me to the final car, the rarest car. A car that'll be more rare than any GT-R or Lancer Evo variation. If you can find this one, good luck, I support your search. Lord knows I tried looking and I couldn't find it. I'm of course talking about the very limited, very exclusive Mitsubishi Pistachio. Yeah, it's a little green 3-door hatchback. It's actually not a K car either because the engine is actually bigger than a K car engine. It's a 1-liter inline 4. That actually beats the K car purposes. K cars had to have an engine displacement, I believe, like below 1 liter somehow, or to some degree. You know, they had a limit so you wouldn't be taxed extra on it. The whole point was that it was cheap to run both as far as fuel and taxes. The Pistachio did not get that K-car tax credit, but it was very fuel efficient. In fact, at the time, I believe it was completely unprecedented in its economy, which was to say it actually got like a combined 72 US miles per gallon, which is insane. And yeah, I know you're gonna say, oh, well, why do we care about that? Eco car. Well, it's just kind of cool, I think, just from that perspective that it was kind of an unprecedented technology in a sense at a time. It's not gonna be the most fun car to drive, I'm pretty sure, though they all were equipped with 5-speed manuals. And, you know, the way they did this was, most of the car's body weight is all in aluminum, so it's very lightweight. It also used a very early start-stop engine technology, which is pretty much standard on all cars sold in the US today that are an ICE car. But back then it was pretty much unheard of. This was brand new at the time. The whole car had like a 1,500 pound curb weight, so with 72 horsepower, I actually don't know if it was probably all that slow. I mean, it certainly wasn't quick, but it's really hard to determine what this car was when there's so few of them made and you can't even find them. They were sold basically to corporations and political figures, local politicians who had these green initiatives, essentially. So people who would kind of use them as kind of like a show car, like, look at us, we're very green because we're using a Mitsubishi Pistachio to move around in. And that was pretty much the whole gist of the car, basically. Now, with that said, are they available? Well, I did come across a picture of one with an aftermarket bumper affixed to it, so I am guessing that these did end up into private hands afterwards. But how many are actually left? I'm going to assume probably less than 50. Is it a valuable car? Hard to say. Without being able to find any, you can't actually get any price data. It very well could be priceless. There's no way it costs as much as a GT-R. But it would be a kind of a cool car, just to talk about, just to have, just be like, look at this, it's the first super fuel efficient car in the world that was a gas engine. I don't know. I mean, maybe some people just think, well, that's kind of dumb, or that's not that interesting. But everyone's got different interests, and I think that's kind of what brings a lot of this together. You know, the cars that I pointed out today, you're not going to see all of these on every major list someone makes, which is kind of the point. And yeah, I get that. A lot of people just want to focus on the really, you know, the sports cars and stuff like that. The GT-Rs, the Lancers, I didn't bring up any Imprezas, but Impreza variations, you know, there's new ones every year practically. And I think these are still all very interesting cars. They're all very different. They appeal to very different groups of people. And, you know, I think that's really cool. I don't know, just the way I look at it, I guess. That's what I got for this list. That's what I got from the Japanese imports. So you can probably expect my Euro import video to be a bit similar. Not just focusing on the really neat cars that people have been waiting for, but just kind of a lot of just interesting things. And I'll admit, I'm a little bit more of a Euro car guy myself. You know, I've never really done an in front of the camera video before. I'm not really sure how you sign off on these. Do I just do my regular outro? Stay tuned, you and your cars.